Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today's lecture, we're going to kind of pick up where we left off last time when we were talking about kind of this very turbulent time in the United States, the 1960s, when our country gets very, very divided. On one side, you have kind of these older Americans, this generation that had been through World War II and the Great Depression that had really kind of come together to deal with these big events that affected everybody in the nation at the time. Well, they kind of had a feeling that, the country was on a good course, that a lot of good things had happened, that the country was getting better all the time. And they really kind of resented the fact that there were challenges to this, right? Especially from coming from younger Americans, this younger generation of kids, these baby boomers. They're being born in an affluent America, all right? They didn't know what it was like to not have a lot of these consumer goods available to them. They didn't know what it was like to not have jobs or worry about where your next paycheck or meal was coming from, right? So there's a bit of a disconnect going on there between these generations. And older Americans, again, felt that they were improving the nation, that the nation was better in the 1940s and 50s than it had been in the 20s and 30s. All right, right? More creature comforts, electrification, indoor plumbing, all these things were being rolled out to Americans. But younger Americans kind of said, hey, look, there's a lot of hypocrisy here, right? Remember, Students for a Democratic Society. They kind of pointed out that America wasn't always living up to all these ideals. We preached constantly that we were the country defending freedom, and yet a lot of our allies in the world were totalitarian states that we said we were opposed to, right? That didn't allow their citizens to have a voice, control over their government. So there's a lot of breakdown here. And of course, one of the places where this really becomes evident is the Vietnam War. Older Americans, for the most part, supported the war. Now, please understand that there's a lot of exceptions here. Not every older American supports the war. Not every younger American's against it. But by and large, these are pretty true breakdowns, right? A lot of younger people really did oppose the war, and a lot of older people supported it. Have to stop communism, have to defend freedom, have to defend our allies. Younger Americans, it's not the right war, it's not the right place, it's not the right enemy, right? The United States is kind of imposing itself on other countries, that it's not a fight against communism, that the Vietnamese just wanted to have their own independent country. So there's a lot going on there, right? And it's coming through in a lot of different ways. Johnson's kind of caught in this very, very difficult position, right? Very precarious. On one hand, he wants to prove he's a cold warrior, prove that he'll stand up to the communists, so that'll give him the ability to kind of do what he wants to do on the national scene, right? At home, he wants to fix some of these big social problems that the United States have. He's committed himself. He's committed the nation to the civil rights cause, right? For the first time since Reconstruction, the United States actually passes laws that says the federal government will defend every race's ability to have a job, to have freedom of education, right? These things that we said we were fighting for the whole time our countries existed. So Johnson, by trying to do one to get the other, ends up making no one happy, right? And we've kind of seen that in the last lecture, how eventually in 1968, Johnson can't even run to be president, right? He could run for a second term, and he knows he's not even popular enough to do that. He kind of hopes people turn to him anyways, but that doesn't happen. Nobody likes Johnson. Older Americans feel that he's kind of giving up on Vietnam, and that's a bad thing. They lied about how the war was going. And then, of course, younger Americans didn't trust him anyways. They felt that he was kind of shortchanging all these big social programs he said he was about. So here in the 1960s, America is a very divided nation, mostly along generational lines, but also along racial lines, along educational lines. There's a lot of fractures in American society. And even that big moment that I talked about at the end of the last lecture, the landing of men on the moon, by the United States, right? This huge achievement within 8 years where we proved our system could do things that no other country could do. Even that can't bring the country together. We go right back to these divisions almost as soon as the astronauts are back on Earth. So that is kind of what we're going to pick up with here today, is kind of see how this coalition of the left, this New Deal Democratic Party that Franklin Roosevelt put together in the 1930s, white Southerners, white Northern liberals, and minorities throughout the country, how that coalition starts falling apart here, and how a new, invigorated Republican Party starts kind of pushing out a new agenda, kind of reinvents itself. in some ways by going back to what it had been talking about back in the 19th century in some ways, right? So that's kind of what we're going to pick up here. And what we're really going to kind of do is we look at this kind of the shifting of political parties here, where the Republican Party that had a lot of liberals in it in the 1940s and 50s becomes a very conservative party, and how the Democratic Party that had a lot of conservatives in it in the 1930s and 40s becomes a very liberal party, right? We're going to see how that shift starts playing out. And you really see it show up in the presidency of Richard Nixon, right? This guy that kind of comes back from political no man's land here at the end of the 1960s and really starts to kind of show just how deep these divisions are and just how this country is changing politically in the 1960s and into the 1970s. So that's kind of what's on tap in this lecture. And because we're covering so much territory here, looking at so many things in the late 60s and in the 70s, this will have to be probably 2 lectures. So be prepared for that as well, okay? All right, so kind of a little bit of a recap here as we kind of go through this, right? Please remember that when the United States commits itself to containing communism, when the United States starts declaring itself as kind of defender of freedom, both at home and abroad, that's going to have big implications domestically as well. As both Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and even Johnson found out, you can't say you're fighting for freedom in one place and deny it in another, right? Kennedy especially felt that dichotomy, that hypocrisy, right? Saying that we're going to have to send troops to Vietnam to fight for freedom when there are young kids protesting that they can't go to schools because of their race, that they can't go to have certain jobs because of their race. So they can't go to stores because of their race. So these issues have to be dealt with. They can't be ignored, right? And the civil rights movement, as powerful as it is, as important as it is, it's going to challenge this coalition, this liberal consensus that's existed since Franklin Roosevelt in the Great Depression for more than 20, 30 years now. The Democratic Party's really been kind of in control of the federal government for the most part during that period. And all of this change, all of this confrontation is really starting to kind of chip away at that coalition. Even Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program isn't getting the kind of the reception he would hope for. The civil rights movement, as we'll talk about a little bit later, becomes more and more radical. New groups, new voices start to spring up saying this change is coming too slowly, that not enough is getting better here in the country, and they want it to change fast, right? Older Americans, of course, kind of see things as kind of going off the rails here. That America's youth is kind of resentful. Don't understand just how good they've got it, right? That they didn't have to sacrifice it like older Americans did, and they kind of felt that these kids should be kind of falling in line. The racial minorities should understand that things are better now than they were before, right? That things like lynchings were kind of disappearing, that a lot of this racial animus was disappearing, and a lot of older Americans felt, well, that's proof of progress. Things are getting better. But younger Americans said, well, it shouldn't be like that at all. Should never have been like that. We need to actually push harder. So here in the 1960s, things are very, very divided. And you can kind of see some of that in what I'm about to go over. What I have on the next few slides, and I know it's a little difficult to see, it's very blurry, but these images are actually from census data from Mississippi from the 1950 census and the 1960 census. And you see some really kind of important things here, right? In these tables, what you should see is that for the most part, in places like Mississippi, especially the Deep South, if you were black, because that was the main minority group in the South at the time, 1 out of 3 black people worked in agriculture, basically as a sharecropper. The next third worked as somebody that provided a service, a cook, a dishwasher, a domestic servant, right, a housekeeper, that kind of thing. Fully 7 out of 10 black people in the South, in Mississippi in the 1950 census, had what we would today consider menial blue-collar jobs, which means to say they didn't make a lot of money. Compare that to the white population, where only about 10 to 15% of the population had those jobs. Most white people fell into higher paying business ownership or kind of professional jobs that paid a lot more. And that had big ramifications. In places like Mississippi, Black people in the state made somewhere around 1/4 to 1/3 what a white person made. Even from the 1950s, during this incredible economic boom, things didn't get much better. So you can kind of see from the lower table in 1960s census, white workers in the state of Mississippi made on average $2,000 a year. Now, that's a small amount by today's comparison, but back in the 1950s and early 1960s, that was actually a living wage. But compare that to what black Americans were making, around $600 a year, right? 1/3 of that. So if you're an African American living in the United States here in the 1950s and in the 1960s, not a lot has changed for you, right? Even with Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier, even with the integration of the military, even with Brown versus Board, even with the March on Washington, your life hasn't changed much. It hasn't gotten a lot better. And of course, that kind of pushes for this idea of how can you fix this, right? Because what we see is these problems, things like racism, Jim Crow laws, have created such a wide disparity in the way people live and who lives where, right? That these are things that you just can't overcome by opening up a school to whites and blacks. It's just not going to change a lot, right? And that's kind of what's at the core of a lot of this. And again, you can kind of see it here in these tables on the top of this page, right? For the most part, African Americans, being about 1/3 of the population of school-going children in Mississippi in the 1950s and 60s, actually had a far lower percentage of kids completing grade schools, right? About 1/3 of them just disappeared, right? Just had to go to work to support their families, whatever it might be. For the most part, almost every white kid in Mississippi finished high school or at least got close. Most African Americans didn't finish the 6th grade. So that is amazing, right? That's going to have huge repercussions. So even if you opened up schools to white and black students, a lot of those black students aren't going to go to those schools. They can't. They have to work to support their families, or the schools they go to are the ones that are close by to them. Even the white ones may not be that great, may not have a lot of accommodations, a lot of things to help them. And in the end, things aren't going to change for them a whole lot. Maybe the best way to see that is in this picture right here of what's called the Mississippi Delta region, right? This prime cotton growing area where a lot of African Americans lived in Mississippi because that's where the old cotton plantations were. And you can kind of see in this photo what we're talking about here, how even opening up education isn't going to change a lot. Because if you kind of look at this, right, these houses have electricity, but there are no street lights, there are no sidewalks, there's no places, no parks for these kids to play in. Most of these houses look like they were built by the owners, very simple, kind of almost shack-like structures. So they don't have a great home environment. There's not a lot of amenities here. Contrast that with the house in the very, very background there, right? Of a more middle-class, typical living standard for most middle-class Americans in the 1950s. So if you're black here in Mississippi, and by extension, really in the United States, here in the 1960s, your world hasn't changed a whole lot over the past decade, even with all the success of the civil rights movement, right? The pushback for the Montgomery bus boycott, you know, the students protesting, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee getting lunch counters to be integrated. It really doesn't matter if those lunch counters are integrated or if these schools are integrated if you can't afford to go to them in the first place. So a lot more change has to be done here, and it is happening, but even Johnson's Great Society program can't change these things that fast, right? It's not going to happen overnight. We're talking about the need for generational improvement here, not something that can be fixed by passing one law 1 year, right? These are things that have to go on for a long time. And that's what kind of opens the door to a bit of a pushback here. Here in the mid 1960s, especially after 1963 and the March on Washington, new voices start to kind of emerge here in the civil rights movement. People like Malcolm X, a young man that kind of changed his life from being kind of an inner city kid that was often running with gangs, getting into legal trouble. He joins what's called the Nation of Islam, kind of a radical Islamic group of the 1960s, and he sees that as a way forward for a lot of African Americans. He starts challenging leaders like Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King, leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Coalition, telling them that what they're doing isn't enough. That in the end, getting to sit next to a white person on a bus really doesn't change the fact that that white person doesn't see you as equal, that that white person won't allow you to do a lot of the things you want to do, that inherently African Americans still had second-class citizenship. And for people like Malcolm X and others during this period, they're calling for a much more aggressive and radical solution to things. They want to kind of separate Black America out of white America, right? They're not necessarily calling for segregation, but they all are calling for a separateness, right? Separate Black communities where Black leaders are in charge, where Blacks can make decisions for themselves and don't have to look for help from white government officials or white establishment figures in their communities, that kind of thing. And in some cases, people like Malcolm X are even advocating that it's okay for African Americans to use violence. Remember, Martin Luther King and other, especially religious civil rights leaders, are saying no, don't use violence. That just allows a lot of people, especially white politicians, to say, well, you can't really help these groups of people. They're too dangerous. They're doing things the wrong way. Well, Malcolm X says, well, if we were truly equal, then we could use violence. Whites use violence against us in lynchings and the KKK. Why can't we use violence back? If we can't, then it means we're not equal. So you can kind of see where that argument would appeal to a lot of younger people that felt the system wasn't working well enough, wasn't working fast enough. A lot of these younger people, like Stokely Carmichael and others, are really starting to say more radical things to people, right? They want this change to come immediately. So I really do tell you, take a listen to this video. It's up on my my YouTube channel. Take a look at it and see what Malcolm X has to say here, what he's kind of advocating. He sees a problem with white America's attitudes towards Black Americans, but he also has a problem with this older generation of Black leaders like Martin Luther King that he thinks, even though they're only like 15 years apart, he sees Martin Luther King as being part of this older generation, as being kind of out of touch with what's really happening on the ground. That for somebody like Malcolm X, nothing's going to happen to that Black neighborhood that I showed you in that picture just a moment ago until there's a massive change in American society, right? Beyond just the ability to go to a school or sit on a bus wherever you want. So there's a lot of challenges happening here at the time, and we kind of have to keep that in mind. And again, one of the things that kind of points out this more radical tone of things, this more immediate sense that things have to change now, is epitomized by a group that emerges in the 1960s, right? That a lot of older Americans look to as proof that things are kind of out of control, that a lot of the civil rights movement is causing danger in American society. And that's the creation of a group called the Black Panthers. It comes out of what's called the Black Power movement of the early 1960s, when a lot of African Americans said, you know, instead of kind of celebrating American culture, by extension, white American culture, they said we should be celebrating our own culture, right? The things that make us distinct. Because after all, a lot of African Americans said we've been segregated, pushed to our own communities, kind of left out of the bigger discussion. Very few of us are in politics or in the media. So why don't we just kind of celebrate ourselves within our own communities? So in a big way, right, African Americans are trying to take charge of their own futures, their own lives. And in one place in particular, this is kind of important. Oakland, California, right here in our home state, has a large African American community in Oakland, California. Now, originally, Oakland was a manufacturing city, for the most part, very white up until the 1930s. But in the 1940s, with World War II and the need for more production, especially in the shipyards, helping build the Navy to fight Japan during World War II, a lot of African Americans had moved to California, especially Los Angeles and San Francisco Bay Area. Well, a lot of African Americans ended up living in Oakland because that was the only place they could afford to live, right? These redlining, these districting where you only allowed certain groups of people to live in certain places was here in California as well. It's why Watts in South Central Los Angeles is where most African Americans live. It's why in West Fresno, most African Americans live in West Fresno. It's because those were the areas where they were allowed to own property or to live. Well, the same is true in the Bay Area. Oakland, California was that place. And by the early 1960s, most of the people living in Oakland were now black, right? It's about half black, and then a large Hispanic community, and then some whites that still lived in the city. But for African Americans, they saw their neighborhoods as being run down, as not being taken care of being crime ridden, right? And they saw that the Oakland police force, they saw it as more of an occupational group, right? As somebody that was oppressing them. The white Oakland police force, made up of white police officers, that almost none of whom lived in the Oakland area. Almost all of them came from other parts of the Bay Area. Well, a lot of African American community leaders saw the Oakland police force as kind of a dangerous institution, one that kind of attacked them and arrested them and treated them illegally, right, in their own homes and in their own communities. So in response, some black leaders in the community, especially Huey Newton and Bobby Seals, people that had already been kind of on the fringes of the civil rights movement, decide to set up their own, what we would today kind of call community watch programs. But they took it to a very different extreme than we're used to, right? They armed themselves. They said, hey, look, we don't trust the police coming into our neighborhoods. We feel they harass us. We feel they use force against us, that they're not treating us fairly. So we're going to watch the police. And they start driving around their communities. They start following police cars in their communities. They're carrying guns openly, like in this picture in the lower left-hand corner when they go to the state capitol in Sacramento to protest the fact that they're not allowed to carry arms out in public like whites are in American society. So the Black Panthers are created here as kind of a response to a lot of this idea that African Americans don't have a lot of control, don't have a lot of say in their own communities. But the Black Panthers aren't just a militant group that's kind of at odds with the police. It's also providing meals to a lot of kids because they come from such poor backgrounds. They're opening up health clinics because there aren't a lot of hospitals, and most of the black population of Oakland can't afford to go to the hospitals anyways. So there's things like the Black Panthers, they're trying to fit in and provide a lot of services, right? Now, people like Huey Newton, Bobby Seals, they're more interested in watching the police. But a lot of black women join the Black Panthers, and they're the ones pushing for these kind of community-based initiatives, right, to help people in their neighborhoods. So here in the 1960s, you see a lot of African Americans trying to take charge, trying to say, hey, look, we're not okay with what's happened here. We're not okay with the slow pace of change. And you also see it in this lower right-hand corner, right? In the 1968 Summer Olympics held in Mexico City, two American sprinters are going to be the odds-on favorites to win the 200-meter dash, right? One of the quickest and most watched events in the Olympics in the 60s and 70s were track and field events. And here in the 1960s, these two American sprinters, both from San Jose State, as a matter of fact, that's where they did their training, that's where they went to college, they were the odds-on favorite to win the gold, right? It was understood that one of them was probably going to win the gold, one was going to probably win the silver or maybe the bronze, but it was going to be one of them to win the gold medal. Well, that happened, right? In the race, these two men end up first and third. An Australian guy ends up kind of in between them. But in the end, when they go to receive their medals, these two track stars do something. They take off their shoes before they get on the podium, kind of reminding people that, hey, we come from poor black neighborhoods, and most of the kids in our neighborhood actually can't afford shoes. So that's the first thing they do, right? To kind of say, hey, look, even here in the Olympics, we want to make a statement. We want to point out that everything is not okay, right? And then comes the big moment, because when you win a medal in the Olympics, of course, one of the things that's supposed to happen is you listen to the anthem of the national anthem of the country whose athlete won the gold medal. Well, here in this event, when the national anthem for the United States is played, the two athletes from the United States that win the gold and the bronze, they stand at attention for the most part, but then they do something else. They give this thing called the Black Power salute, a raised fist, a raised clenched fist, signifying solidarity with the African American community, saying that, yes, I participated for my country, but I also did this for the black community back home. Now, today we wouldn't think a whole lot of this, right? It's not that big of a deal to many of us. But at the time, it was a huge controversy. Within days of getting their medals and doing this kind of protest move, as it was seen at the time during the award ceremony, both these athletes are going to be stripped of their medals. They're going to be sent home to the United States early. They're not going to be able to kind of enjoy themselves at the Olympic Games. And even when they get home back to San Jose and San Jose State, they're going to find their careers are kind of put on hold. They're not going to be able to get jobs. They're not going to be able to continue their education. That they kind of become pariahs in the sports world. And it's not until decades later, the 80s and 90s, that they kind of rehabilitate themselves and get kind of acknowledged for the great thing they did in the Olympics and for the way they kind of held themselves up during really trying times afterwards. So here in the 1960s, you see that these issues in American society are starting to spill out all over the page, right? You just can't get away from it. It's happening in the streets of places like Oakland. It's even happening in the Olympics when you think, hey, I can get away from all of this for a few minutes. Actually, you can't, right? It's even there, as a matter of fact. And in some ways, we're still kind of dealing with these issues, right? One of these controversies is today still whether athletes can kind of protest different things going on in American society. Colin Kaepernick for the San Francisco 49ers football team is a prime example of this, right? When the 49ers, some of the players, especially black players, started kneeling, saying, hey, look, we don't feel that African Americans are being treated the same by police as white Americans are. They protested by taking a knee during the national anthem, trying to not be disrespectful, but also show that they wanted attention to this problem. Some Americans applauded them for standing up and exercising their freedom of speech. Other Americans criticized them for disrespecting the nation, for not doing things the right way. And that is exactly the split that's happening in the 1960s. When John Carlos and Tommy Neal both protest at the 1968 Olympics, they know that they're not ready for what's going to happen. Just like maybe like Colin Kaepernick's not ready for what's going to happen to him. They're going to lose their careers just like Colin Kaepernick does. So a lot of Americans in the 1960s are using the same arguments that we hear today in the past few years over athletes kind of protesting and kind of taking a stand on social issues, when a lot of older Americans or certain groups of Americans really would just rather the athletes just play the games and not be heard from in kind of a social context. So these divisions in American society are very deep during this period. And it explodes on the scenes in a lot of ways, right? Again, while African Americans in the United States are kind of trying to build their communities up, trying to kind of take some agency over themselves, their lives, and try to kind of carve their own place out in American society by having celebrities like James Brown, a black entertainer in the 1950s and 60s, right, saying things like songs that saying black and proud. The idea of black pride, that it's okay to be black, that you can kind of embrace your ethnicity and be different than everybody else, right? To support groups like the Black Panthers that are standing up to the police, they're maybe even going and attacking the police at times, that was okay. And it kind of leads to a lot of unrest, even in places like northern and western cities, right? Not southern cities where there were a lot of lynchings. There's a lot of Jim Crow laws. Even in places like New York City, African Americans feel kind of segregated and pushed out, right? They have a riot in 1964 during a power outage in the summer of 1964, where thousands of people are injured and rampaging in the streets, fighting with each other, damage done to buildings. The next year in California and South Central Los Angeles, a neighborhood known as Watts, there's a massive riot that takes place over several days where more than 30 people are killed, a couple hundred wounded or injured in this rioting. 8 square blocks of Los Angeles basically burned to the ground, most of them African American communities, right? uh, Homes, businesses in the African American community. So here in the 1960s, there's a lot of division, there's a lot of anger building up, right? Chicago sees a riot in 1966, so every summer there's a major event taking place that really kind of grips the nation and really frightens a lot of people, especially the one in Detroit, Michigan in 1967, right? That was such a huge riot. It went on for several days. More than 40 people are killed, at least 40 were killed, several hundred wounded. It took the National Guard to come in using machine guns on American citizens, right? Well, one hotel or motel in Detroit was attacked by the National Guard, and about 12 people were killed there, most of whom were not armed or were actually just hiding from the rioting and ended up getting killed by the National Guard. So this country looks like it's a country in chaos at the time. It looks like we're out of control, and a lot of people are looking for somebody to kind of come in, calm things down, and kind of bring some calmness to the country. Right? It feels like this is a country spinning out of control in the 1960s in some ways. Again, the what's behind a lot of this is what I talked about earlier with the Black Panthers. The Watts riots in 1965 were spurred in part by what the African American community in Watts felt was police harassment. White police officers that weren't living in their neighborhoods, didn't have any connection to their communities, would drive through, sometimes pull over black drivers or stop black teens on the street, harass them, arrest them for very minor infractions that they wouldn't do to a white pedestrian or to a white motorist. And it led to a lot of anger and resentment on the part of the African American community. It explodes in the summer of 1965. A white police officer pulls over a black motorist for a broken tail light, which even that is up for debate whether that was actually true or not. The police officer could have broken the tail light when he confronted the motorist. The black motorist ends up being dragged from his car, beaten by the police, arrested, and taken away. And the black community erupts in anger. And for 2 or 3 days, Los Angeles is gripped by rioting. And again, blocks of the city are burned down because the police and the fire department don't even feel it's safe enough to go into these black neighborhoods. They just let it burn. And in the end, even African American civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King are kind of shocked by all of this, right? Martin Luther King comes and tours Watts just a few days after the rioting ends. And as he walks along the streets of Watts, seeing the devastation, seeing where people were killed or injured in the rioting, he notices that there's a lot of young black people on the streets, and they seem to be cheering. Not that a civil rights leader has come to kind of see what happened and do something about it, but they're actually cheering the riots. Martin Luther King hears these kids saying, "We won, we won." And King actually stops in the middle of this march through this territory or this devastation and looks at these young kids and says, "How can you say you've won? 34 people are dead, your community's destroyed, and now white people are using the riots as an excuse to say, why should we help them? They're just going to riot and destroy the place anyways." And these kids answer back with really what you would understand is the root cause of this. They said, "We won because we made them pay attention to us." Right? Think about it. What these young kids in Watts are saying is, look, nothing's changed. Nothing's better. Right? They passed the Civil Rights Act. They passed the Voting Rights Act. Supposedly there's all these programs to make things better in the country, but nothing's changed here. Everything's exactly the way it's been for a decade, a couple of decades, right? So there's a lot of angst over the pace of change here in the 1960s. People want things to move quicker. And in some ways, right, you can kind of understand it. I mean, if you see this picture from the 1967 Detroit riot, here's a white National Guard officer with a bayonet and a rifle standing over several rioters, black men, right? And basically threatening them. You can see this one black man's obviously injured, and that National Guardsman is not trying to help him at all, right? He's just telling him, just lay there, just stay quiet, right? So it's very confrontational. For a lot of African Americans, you feel like, nobody's listening to you. Nothing's going to change unless you get up and do something about it. And in a way, kind of hearkening back to Colin Kaepernick and the 49ers and that kind of controversy, that's really what's been gripping our country for the last decade or so, right? These things are still happening in our society. Places like Ferguson, Missouri, where Michael Brown was shot by a white police officer while walking down the street. Maybe he had committed a small infraction crime. We're not sure exactly what happened, but we do know the police officer shot and killed a black unarmed man on the street in the middle of the day. Not something that's happening to white people in Ferguson, Missouri. So the black community erupts in anger. There's rioting. The next year in Baltimore happens again, right? A black motorist is pulled over by white police officers. He's arrested for a very minor infraction, thrown in the back of a police van, and on his way to jail, his neck is broken somehow. And the black community wants to know, how is that happening? It doesn't happen to white motorists, right? These things never happen to white motorists. So why is it happening to black motorists? So they erupt in anger, in resentment, and kind of fighting back against a system they feel is not listening to them. So over and over again, a lot of these problems in the 1960s haven't been resolved in a very meaningful way. And we'll kind of talk about why that is over the next few lectures. But for the most part, you see the black community is still dealing with a lot of the same issues 50, 60 years later, right? Now that brings us to 1968, which isn't a presidential election year. Remember, Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States, should be a shoo-in to win re-election. This guy is fighting the war in Vietnam, so it's a wartime president. We usually like to support wartime presidents. He's passed the Civil Rights Act. He's helped pass the Voting Rights Act. He's bringing real change. The Great Society program is seen as important to a lot of Americans. So this guy should easily be able to win re-election, and he doesn't even feel he can run for president again. On top of that, right, you have this rioting and then, of course, some other tragic events. In April of 1968, Martin Luther King goes to Memphis, Tennessee to kind of keep pushing for this change in civil rights, to keep pushing for this end of segregation. There are still places in the country that have segregation on the books, and it's still being enforced 4 years after the Civil Rights Act. So he's still trying to get things to change here in the country. But after he's given a speech outside his hotel room in Memphis, a shot rings out and he is assassinated by a white conservative Klansman, right? Somebody affiliated with the Klan and white supremacy. Rioting breaks out throughout the year across most of the United States. Even Fresno, Los Angeles, San Francisco saw rioting in response to Martin Luther King's assassination. At the same time this is happening, right, we're holding presidential primaries. The Democratic Party's trying to see who's going to be their new leader without Lyndon Johnson running for office again. President Kennedy's brother, former Attorney General for the United States, Robert Kennedy, announces his candidacy. At first, it doesn't look like he's going to do that well, but suddenly in June, he wins the California primary, and people are starting to get involved in his campaign. He's picking up momentum, and then he's assassinated when he's giving his victory speech in a Los Angeles hotel ballroom in June of 1968. So here in 1968, a lot of bad things are happening. A lot of important voices like Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy are kind of being removed from the stage. It allows these louder, more extreme voices to carry even more weight, to kind of dominate the conversation, if you will. And that very much erupts here in the Democratic Party. Again, this coalition that's been built in the 1930s and 40s that has allowed Democrats to really kind of hold power in the nation's politics is starting to fall apart. A a lot of younger people that kind of identify with the Democratic Party and this idea of social change and making things better in the country, again, feel it's moving too slow, that not enough has been done, that people like Johnson are just moving too slowly and not being aggressive and radical enough for their tastes. So at the 1968 Democratic convention, where they're going to choose the person that's going to run for president for the Democratic Party, that convention becomes a bit of a fiasco, right? Thousands of young people show up outside the convention, demanding a voice in the convention. Of course, older people, the establishment figures for the Democratic Party, don't want that to happen because they're afraid of kind of the radical message that'll be pushed onto the Democratic Party, that they'll have to turn to a more radical Democratic candidate. So they try to keep them out. The mayor of Chicago calls in the National Guard to try and keep these young protesters out of the convention. Chaos just reigns during this convention when a group of these students break into the convention and disrupt the proceedings and kind of make it difficult for the party to actually choose a leader. So during 1968, right, there's a lot of chaos going on in the country. A lot of people just feel this country is just spinning out of control. And it kind of makes what happens next kind of understandable. You may not like it, you may not agree with it, but you can definitely understand why it works out the way it does. Because there's one person that kind of comes along saying he can fix it, that he can kind of find the equilibrium again, that he can kind of put things back in order. And that, of course, is Richard Nixon. So after Kennedy and Martin Luther King are kind of taken out of the picture here in 1968, the focus squarely of the country is on who's going to be the next president, who's going to kind of deal with all these issues, who can deal with all of them, right? The Democratic Party, after the fiasco that their political convention was in Chicago, decides to go with the safe choice. Vice President of the United States, Hubert Humphrey, who's actually a pretty liberal Democrat, he's going to run for president. But he essentially is going to run on Lyndon Johnson's platform. He's going to continue the war in Vietnam. He's going to continue the Great Society program and basically do all the things Johnson would have done if he was elected. But here's the thing. If Johnson doesn't feel he can run on his own platforms and initiatives, why should somebody else be able to run on it, right? In the end, Humphrey's campaign is almost doomed to failure. Making things worse for the Democratic Party is the fact that the white Southerners decide they no longer are really interested in being a part of the Democratic Party. The Democrats have been pushing for a lot of social change. They've been pushing back against segregation and Jim Crow laws, and a lot of white Southerners feel the Democratic Party is no longer their party. Remember, people like Franklin Roosevelt may not have liked Jim Crow, but he didn't do a lot to stop Jim Crow laws, right? Well, that's changed now by the 1960s. The Democratic Party is against Jim Crow, is against white supremacy in the South. So in response, George Wallace, a Democrat, runs as an independent candidate, runs as a Southern candidate, saying he's for segregation now and forever, that if he's elected president, he'll make sure white Southerners stay in control in the South, that nothing changes in the South. So the Democratic Party really kind of falls apart here in 1968. Young Democrats don't like the direction that the party's going in overall. White Southerners don't like what the Democratic Party's doing. White liberals in the North feel like they're losing control of their own party. The Republican Party, on the other hand, doesn't have any of these problems. They kind of rally around one candidate pretty quickly. A guy that's familiar with them, somebody that's been vice president of the United States, was narrowly defeated for president in 1960. And that is Richard Nixon. He gets a comeback that few politicians ever get. He gets to come back and win the presidency after having lost it in 1960. And how does he do that? How does he appeal to a lot of Americans? Well, he says that, hey, look, there's a lot of Americans out there that are supporting the Vietnam War. There's a lot of Americans that feel things are kind of out of control. They just want things to go back to normal. And he says, I'm your president. I'm going to take care of all that stuff. He calls himself the law and order candidate, that he's going to win the war in Vietnam, that he has a secret plan to do so. Well, for a lot of Americans, even some young Americans, right, this is a pretty enticing proposition that Nixon gives them, that he can win the war, make America look good on the international stage. He can kind of rectify all of this violence in our society, all this chaos that's taking place on the streets of the United States, and he can kind of put things back to normal. A lot of Americans like this idea. And as you can see in this electoral map of the 1968 election, Nixon wins pretty easily, right? He's got a pretty big margin here. Now, in the popular vote, it's actually pretty close because a lot of the states Nixon carries are kind of these rural states, right, without a lot of urban centers. But he does carry a few of those. Now, Humphrey and the mainline Democrats win kind of the traditional northeastern part of the country that Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman had counted on for a long time, and including Texas. But what's interesting here is a lot of Southern Democrats don't stick with the Democratic candidate. They go with the white supremacists, the American Independent Party's George Wallace. And in the end, that's who that is one of the big factors. If those southern states had gone with who they normally had gone with, Hubert Humphrey might have eked out a victory barely, but they don't. Right? We see something interesting happening. The South is getting way more conservative. The South is starting to look to the Republican Party for the first time in a long time. One of the things that Richard Nixon does is he says he has a Southern strategy. He goes down and campaigns in the South for the first time in probably 50, 60 years. A Republican candidate actually goes down into the South and tells white Southerners, hey, vote for me, I'll leave you alone. And that message really resonates with a lot of Southerners. In 1968, the state of Virginia, that has voted Democrat since 1868, turns around and votes Republican, right? First time in 100 years. Well, one of the reasons they're doing that is most of the school districts in Virginia are still segregated. They feel that the Republican Party won't force them to integrate, won't force them to end segregation. So for a lot of white Southerners, the Republican Party is now kind of the answer. And here in 1968, it's not going to be complete yet, but by 1980, this transition will be over. Texas and every southern state will be voting Republican now, where they used to vote Democrat. Most northeastern states will continue to vote Democrat. And the big question is, what happens out west? Do they become Democratic states? Do they become Republican states? And that's been kind of the state of our politics since the 1960s. And you can kind of see these big issues that we've been talking about are having a real impact here politically on the United States. They're setting the stage for where we are, this divided nation that we're in now. Its roots, the roots of these divisions are right here in the 1960s. So now kind of turning our attention to the Nixon administration here, right? Nixon is able to pull a lot of this, pull this victory out, so to speak, because he does say, look, there's a lot of Americans, especially older Americans, that kind of want things to go back the way they were. And in some ways, he's right. A lot of older Americans just felt that things were a little out of control, that they needed to be kind of put back to their rightful place, right? Kind of restore order to the country. And of course, Nixon kind of plays this propaganda up. He accuses the Democratic Party of siding with the protesters. Even though the protesters are protesting against the Democratic Party, he paints the Democrats as on the sides of all this chaos, right? That he says that it's federal activism, things like LBJ, starting the civil rights legislation that allows the federal government to come in and monitor what's going on in businesses, monitor what's going on in schools. Nixon says he's not going to do any of that. And of course, one of the big things that a lot of Americans like is he says he has a secret plan to win the war, that Nixon's going to make sure the United States has peace with honor, that we're not going to lose a war. Right? Most Americans don't like the idea. They feel that makes us look weak against the Soviet Union and communism, that we need to win. So once Nixon becomes president of the United States, these are the things he's promised, right? That he's going to kind of clean up America. He's going to get rid of kind of this radical fringe that's kind of seems to be taking over the country. That he's going to win this war in Vietnam. Well, it quickly turns out that his secret plan to win the war is to just turn the war over to the Vietnamese. Let the North and South Vietnamese fight it out for who controls the country. Slowly but surely begin pulling our troops out, trying to negotiate a deal with the communist North and get out of there as best we can. But to convince the North to come and negotiate, Nixon has to expand the war. He starts invading Cambodia and Laos, two neighboring countries to Vietnam, and starts expanding our air campaign, dropping bombs on more and more parts of North Vietnam. So it's here in the 1960s when Nixon becomes president that the war actually expands, right? Even though the number of troops in Vietnam may be going down very slowly, the scale of the war erupts, right? The American troops are now in multiple countries in Southeast Asia, destabilizing Laos and Cambodia even more than they already were, and leading to more and more death on a huge scale in that part of the world. And of course, that means if the war is going on and actually kind of expanding in scope, that these protests aren't going to stop anytime soon either. In May of 1970, right, just about a year into Nixon's administration, there are still as many demonstrations against the war as there had been before he was president. At Jackson State in Mississippi, a bunch of black college students say, hey, wait a minute, we're still not being treated the same. We're still not being given equal opportunities here on campuses in Mississippi. And they're attacked by the state police after black students kind of take over part of the campus. And in a shootout with the police, 2 students are killed and about a dozen are wounded. In the end, the black students are forced to surrender and turn themselves over to the police and are sent to prison. This is a defining moment in the South, right? It kind of proves that there's not a lot of changes happen. But the one protest that really captures the nation's attention is what happens at Kent State in Ohio. There on that campus, a lot of young college students, protesters against the war, had been marching on the campus for days. The campus president had been trying to stop these demonstrations, especially because he felt that they were getting out of control, that they were starting to kind of attack members of the campus, especially the ROTC program. That's a military program on a lot of campuses, including Fresno State. It's called the Reserve Officer Training Corps. It's a way for people that are going into the military to kind of continue on with their college education while they're in the military or when they're getting ready to go in the military. Well, a lot of these young student protesters at Kent State were walking around campus harassing these military students that were on their campus. And a lot of the military students were starting to feel kind of threatened, right? Understandably so. In response, the president of the university asked for help. He wants the governor of the state to clamp down on these protests and to stop it. In response, the governor calls out the National Guard, sends about 2,000 National Guardsmen armed with assault rifles and bayonets, and to stop these student protesters. When the students continue to protest, somebody throws something at the National Guardsmen. A lot of the students are screaming at the National Guardsmen, threatening them. One of the National Guardsmen, an 18-year-old kid, is very afraid, doesn't know what's going on. His finger slips, he shoots, and when one National Guardsman shoots, they all shoot, and pretty soon you've got 4 dead kids on campus, 9 wounded by their own military. So here in 1970, even after Nixon's is president, it doesn't look like a whole lot's been fixed here, right? It still looks like the country is embroiled in chaos, that we're still just not able to kind of get beyond this moment and begin fixing a lot of our problems. But while this is taking place, the Nixon administration is beginning to negotiate with the North Vietnamese, with the communists. They have to. The U.S. military is kind of broken here in early 1970s America. There's a lot of people, because of the draft, serving in the military that don't want to be there, don't feel that this is a war worth fighting for. Many of them feel the war is winding down and they don't want to die for a war that's already over, in their opinion. So there's a lot of resentment in the U.S. military about what's going on. And of course, everybody knows these peace talks are taking place. So nobody really wants to be involved in this war anymore. And eventually, what ends up happening is the Nixon administration will sign a deal in 1972 with the Vietnamese government, the North Vietnamese government, and the United States troops will be pulled out of Vietnam by 1974. Only a small contingent will be left kind of in the extreme south part of the country as training advisors. They won't conduct combat operations or anything like that. So here in 1972, it does look like the Nixon administration is getting a handle on the war. It may not be exactly the victory he promised, but at this point, a lot of Americans just want the war to end. Even those that had been supporting the war just a few years earlier agree it's just time to give up and get out. And that is kind of what the Nixon administration is doing. So in some ways, Nixon is going to be pretty successful here, getting people what they want at the time, but maybe not exactly the way they wanted it. And what we kind of see here in the Nixon administration is he's going to have to bend to the reality, right? When he's running for president in 1968, he's going to say, "Hey, look, I can do all these wonderful things. I can kind of wave a magic wand and make everything better." But once he's president, he realizes that's not going to really happen, right? The best he can do is kind of accept the limits that are now apparent to the United States. The way to kind of think about this is since World War II ended in 1945, the United States unquestionably has been able to do whatever it wants, wherever it wants. But here in the 1970s, the United States is stretched so thin, is now in every part of the globe, right? We have troops stationed on every continent. We have military alliances with countries in every kind of part of the world. The United States is finding it hard to kind of keep all of this balanced and running. And the Nixon administration has to kind of understand that. So Nixon doesn't give up on the idea of containment. He still sees communism as dangerous, but he does kind of tweak the old Truman doctrine. We're not going to defend every single country against communism, just the ones that matter. And Vietnam didn't matter, right? In the end, our interests weren't really going to be affected by whether Vietnam was a democratic or a communist state, right? And that in the end, the Nixon administration was going to do sort of what the Eisenhower administration had done. And that makes sense because he was vice president under Eisenhower. Pull back on the use of American military power, use covert operations to try and influence things, overthrow the government of Chile in 1972, put in a right-wing military dictatorship that listens to the United States, do that in a couple other countries in South America, right? And at the same time, while trying to kind of build up anti-communist forces in different parts of the world, the Nixon administration would also negotiate with communist countries like North Vietnam, and of course the big one in 1972, China. Nixon's the first U.S. Government official, right, president of the United States, to officially acknowledge the fact that China was a communist state. Since the 1949 revolution took place in China, we've insisted that the government of Taiwan was a legitimate government of China. That wasn't the case. Nixon goes to China in 1972, acknowledges that Mao Zedong and the communists are the ones that are in charge of China, and starts opening up dialogue, starts opening up diplomatic relations with them. And then he even starts opening up more dialogue with the Soviet Union, with the Russians. He asked for an arms limitation. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had an insane amount of nuclear weapons pointed at each other. Nixon decided that the best thing to do here is maybe cut down on that. These are big, expensive weapon systems. Neither country needs that many. Why not get rid of some? So here in the 1970s, Nixon's kind of going against type, if you will, right? This is a guy who in the 1950s said, hey, if we have to fight a nuclear war with the Russians, let's do it. And now he's actually trying to limit the chances of a nuclear war. This is a guy who said, we're going to have victory in Vietnam, and yet everybody acknowledges we're not going to win. We're going to lose. It's just how quickly and how easily can we get out. So that kind of in some ways kind of sums up Nixon's administration in many ways. He's going to run against type in a manner of speaking, right? Some historians have kind of labeled him, he's kind of an accidental liberal in a way. And it tells you something. This guy who's a very right-wing guy has to do a lot of left-wing things because that's just where the country is. Liberals and a lot of young kids in the colleges have actually shifted the country to the left here in the 1960s, right? The civil rights programs, all of that has actually kind of moved the country in a certain way. And you kind of see this play out during Nixon's administration. In 1962, a woman, a biologist, a marine biologist by the name of Rachel Carson, wrote a book called Silent Spring. She said, look, pesticides like DDT are killing animals, right? Destroying the environment. We have to do something about it. That became another cause that a lot of people were rallying around, just like economic justice, just like gender equality, just like racial equality. Well, there was a call that, hey, we need to clean up the planet. Places like Los Angeles, you couldn't see the sky anymore. It was so polluted. In places like in Ohio, the rivers would catch on fire because there was so much pollution, both trash and just chemicals in the water, that it was dangerous to even be near the water. And in 1970, we hold the first Earth Day on April 22nd of 1970, where millions of people across the nation and across the globe said, hey, look, we've got to fix this. We've got to stop doing this. Now, Nixon had run saying, look, the federal government's not going to get involved in your life. We're going to scale back the federal government, not increase it and put it into more control of your life. And yet he does exactly the opposite because people are calling for it. In 1970, Nixon creates the Environmental Protection Agency, authorizing the government to step in and make sure companies don't pollute the atmosphere, don't pollute the water, make the country a more livable place. So the power and scope of the government is actually expanding here in Nixon's administration when you would expect it to actually be pulled back, right? Which of course is going to anger some of his followers, right? Some of his supporters. But in the end, they don't really have anybody else to go to at this point. So he's really the only answer for most conservative Americans here. But just to kind of point out to you how real this problem was, right? In the 1960s, California's population is exploding. People are moving from all over the country to California because they see it as a place to kind of restart their lives, where there's a lot of economic opportunity. And of course, it's great weather, right? Don't have to shovel snow, that kind of stuff. So in the 1960s, the population of California had already doubled from the 1940s and was about to double again, right? In the 1970s, it was more than 20 million Californians living in the state. And about 50, 60% of them all had cars, which means there were now more cars in California in 1970 than there had been people in 1955, right? Which means places like Los Angeles, that picture in the upper left-hand corner, now look like that. Keep this in mind. Hollywood started in the 1920s in California, in Los Angeles, because the air was so clear, it was great for photography. Well, that's not the case anymore by the 1970s. The air is awful, it's dangerous, and people look to the federal government to help sort that out, to help fix that problem. Same thing with water quality. In Ohio, the Cuyahoga River catches on fire in 1968 for about 2 days. They just have to let it burn. It is so polluted, there's just no way to put the fire out. So a lot of Americans are saying, hey, wait a minute, we've got to fix this. It can't stay like this. And of course, they look to the federal government to fix it. And even though Nixon has said he wasn't interested in expanding federal power, he has to do just that. Once he creates the EPA, then he has the Clean Air Act passed, and of course the Clean Water Act is passed by Congress. He agrees to it, and he enforces those laws. That's what the job of the president is, right? The executive branch is to execute laws. Well, that's what he ends up doing. So even though he said he didn't want to do these things when he was running for president, he ends up doing them when he is president. And also, when Nixon told the South in his Southern strategy, hey, look, I'm not going to force desegregation on you. I'm not going to enforce all these desegregation rules and all this, these Civil Rights Act rules. In fact, he actually does, right? He's forced to. The courts say in the 1970s, you have to desegregate schools, not just in southern states, but everywhere. Turns out that most northern cities are very racially divided as well, right? They had just as much enforced segregation as southerners had. It was just done much quieter. Well, places like Boston were forced to desegregate, often by the federal government. People didn't like it. They protested. They hated that, but it happened anyways. So here in the 1970s, the Nixon administration is actually doing a lot of things that it said it would never do. It would make you think that he would lose re-election here. But in 1972, when he runs for re-election, he's the only game in town. The Democratic Party is broken because of the 1968 election. Young Democrats don't like older Democrats. Older Democrats don't like younger Democrats. They can't solidify around a candidate. In the end, the Democratic Party chooses George McGovern, a very liberal person from the Midwest, and he loses resoundingly in a landslide to Nixon, right? He just gets destroyed politically. And it just shows us that even though Nixon has moved a lot to the center here, a lot of people are still hoping that he can kind of guide us through this, that he can find some middle ground that's acceptable to everybody, right? And that brings us to maybe our last big moment here of this lecture, right? And that's that there's something else kind of going on coterminously with all of these other things I've been talking about, right? There's another movement that's taking place here, starting in the 50s, but really picking up steam in the 60s and 70s, that's going to complicate and really kind of add a new dimension to everything. And that, of course, is the women's rights movement. Here in the 1960s, the women's rights movement really kind of is carried along by a lot of these other issues in American society, and you kind of see why that is, right? A lot of women in this country are going to think now's the time to fix a lot of problems that have been plaguing this country gender-wise since almost the very beginning. Now, what happens here in this wave of women's rights is a little bit distinct, right? This one starts in the 1950s, and it is different than what had happened before. For the most part, women's rights in the 19th and early 20th century was about getting women political rights, especially the right to vote, to have a political say in things. Now, it went deeper than that as well. There were women pushing for more social equality, legal equality, all of those things as well. But for most women, it was really about political voice. But here in the 1950s and into the 1960s, a lot of women were saying, hey, look, there's a lot of us working outside the home, but most of us don't have access to the careers that men have. Out of the nation's doctors, less than 10% were female. Same for lawyers. And those that were doctors and lawyers only made about 60% of what a man did with the same degree in the same field. And a lot of women also found out that they couldn't go to the same schools men did. Places like Harvard and Yale did not accept women on their campuses until the late 60s or early 70s, right? So for a lot of women, especially those that were involved in the civil rights movement, were involved in making sure that African Americans had their right to vote, they started to realize, hey, wait a minute, I'm fighting for this person over here to have equality when I myself don't have it as well, right? And of course, there were some issues unique to women that were kind of wrapped up in all of this, right? People like Margaret Sanger in the 1920s had been pushing for women, now that they had the right to vote, to use that right to take some control over their lives, especially in the area of birth control, to make it legal to women who weren't married. Well, that never really happened in a large scale in the United States. But here in the 50s and 60s, a lot of women who wanted to work, who didn't want to maybe conform and get married and have kids and live in the suburbs, wanted access to birth control so that they didn't have to worry about having a family when they weren't prepared to have a family. But that was still something that was only available to married women, often only with the permission of their husband. So here in the 1950s and 60s, a lot of women say it's time to kind of start changing things, right? They really want to push for change on the same level that the civil rights movement is finally bringing real change for African Americans. And that makes sense because a lot of women are involved in these movements, right? Again, the Montgomery bus boycott is actually planned by women, right? Black women in Montgomery, Joanne Robinson and others are the ones that are making that happen. SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the 1960 movement to kind of desegregate lunch counters, started by women, right? And the Southern Christian Leadership Coalition, led by Martin Luther King, actually run by women. They just weren't allowed to be the leaders in these movements, right? In these organizations. So a lot of women started resenting and pushing back against these things, right? They wanted control over their lives. They wanted more say in what happened in the world. And they, of course, wanted positions of leadership, which kind of makes sense, right? And they actually have a degree of support here, if you will. They have one place that they can go to say, look, you have to actually allow us access to Harvard and Yale. You have to allow us access to jobs, just like you do for African Americans or any other minority group, because of a part of the Civil Rights Act. When the Civil Rights Act was written in 1964, one of the clauses, one of the enforcement clauses that allowed the United States government to make sure that people treated people equally said you cannot discriminate based on race or sex, meaning gender, right? Meaning women had to have the same rights as men. So there was there's a mechanism there for this change, if you will, right? And women had actually been calling for this. The reason this was kind of a part of the Civil Rights Act is twofold. One, because a politician, a white congressman from Virginia, added those two words, hoping to make it so radical that it wouldn't pass, hoping that to make the Civil Rights Act just seem too dangerous because it would upend too much of American society. But in the end, it did. And in part, that's because of people like Betty Friedan. She had been calling out kind of this hypocrisy in American culture for a long time. She was a woman's author, a writer for a lot of magazines, especially women's magazines in the 1950s. She had a college education. She was married, had kids. But she was kind of saying, look, women want choices just like men do. She writes a book in 1963 called The Feminine Mystique that kind of exposes this limited world that women have to live in, where they're allowed to do one thing or the other, but they can't do both, even though every man can. Every man can get married, have a family, and have a career at the same time, because they're not expected to stay home and take care of the kids and do that kind of stuff. Well, Friedan points out that, hey, women want those same opportunities, and they should have them just like anybody else. Otherwise, we're not equal. Otherwise, we're not truly free like each other should be, right? So she kind of sets the stage for this. She helps create an organization called NOW, the National Organization for Women, to push for these changes, to allow women to have divorce rights, to allow women to have property rights in and of themselves. That in a marriage, women should get half of what the marriage is accumulated if they're the ones going to be forced to stay home and take care of the kids. Half of what the husband makes is really their entitlement, right? They help create that opportunity for the man to go out and make that money. So women here in the 1960s are pushing for a lot of change, and it kind of creeps into the Civil Rights Act, saying, "Hey, look, if you're gonna make it free, if we're talking about freedom for some, it has to be freedom for all." And those words "or sex" added to the Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act means the federal government now has to make sure that people don't discriminate anybody for any reason. And women are going to utilize that to try and change things in American society over and over again. Try to make sure schools like Harvard are accessible to women. Make sure that when women are hired, they're given the same jobs, the same pay as men. Make sure that women are treated legally the same as men. And of course, all right, there's a lot of reasons for this. Cartoons during the 1970s tried to point out that when men were proud of their business acumen, their ability to start businesses, to amass wealth. But women who did the very same things often didn't make the same amount of money, or if they were in the same exact career spaces, right? They just weren't as successful because they were just limited. What their expectations were always toned down and kind of forced into more limited roles. So here in the 1960s and into the 1970s, there's a lot of women kind of pushing back against this status quo, just like African Americans and other groups throughout the country are. And you kind of see it exposed or kind of brought up in a very clear way. The Boston Marathon is a famous race that takes place every spring in this country, right? And in 1967, it becomes a big moment of controversy. You see, the Boston Marathon did not allow women to compete. Well, one woman, Catherine Switzer, felt that was unfair. And based on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, she felt like, hey, wait a minute, I should be able to run in this marathon, right? Women should be able to run in the same race as a man and compete with men. That should be perfectly okay. So she tries to apply to the race to run in the Boston Marathon in 1967, and she's denied. The race says, look, or the organizers of the race say, look, women can't compete in this. The race is too long and too arduous. Well, to Catherine Switzer, who's a track star there in Massachusetts, she says, that's ridiculous. I've run marathons before. I can obviously run the 26 miles that's needed. I want to participate. They say, look, the race rules say no women. This is a men's only event. We don't want women participating. Well, she says, look, that is unfair. The race says we don't care. We're not changing our rules. So she tries something different. She puts in another application, but this time instead of writing out her name, she just puts her initial K, Switzer. Well, when the race officials see this application, they think K stands for Kevin or Carl or whatever. They think she's a guy, and they allow her to participate. They give her a number and give her a starting time. Well, when she shows up, the race officials say, hey, wait a minute, you're a woman, you can't race. But she shows them her application that's been approved, and she says, you have to let me race. So they let her get on the course. She begins running the marathon. But pretty quickly, the president of the race association, the Boston Marathon, runs out onto the track to stop her. He's afraid that if she gets out there and runs this race, then it'll prove that women can participate and be a part of the marathon, and that means that their rules will all fall apart. So he tries to drag her off the marathon course and stop her from competing. Her boyfriend at the time, one of the participants in the race, and several other men in the area say, hey, wait a minute, that's not right. You let her race, she's got a number, she's here, let her run, right? So they actually push the race official out of the way, and Catherine Switzer is able to finally finish the race. Much slower than she would want to, but she was able to participate, and that is a big change. But look at what this guy, Will Connolly, the race official that tried to pull her off the course, kind of says. And this kind of explains what's happening here in the 1960s in a big way, right? Will Connolly would say afterwards, women can't run in the marathon because the rules forbid it. Unless we have rules, society will be in chaos. I don't make the rules, but I try to carry them out. We have no space in the marathon for any unauthorized person, even a man. If that girl were my daughter, I would spank her. Now, up to that last sentence, right, you can kind of understand the position of older Americans. You may not agree with it, but you can kind of understand it. They're taking the position, we're just enforcing the rules. This is just the way it is. I don't like it. Maybe you don't like it, but we have to kind of work with what we've got. That makes sense on a superficial level. Now, why can't the rules be changed? He doesn't mention. But here at the end, he does kind of address that, right? Think about this. This guy is saying, this woman, Catherine Switzer, right? She's in her 20s when she does this. He's saying, if that girl were my daughter, I'd spank her. You can't spank grown people, grown adults, right? So he's still kind of patronizing here. He's still treating women as people that need to be controlled. The men need to take care of them and tell them what to do. So it's a pretty amazing moment here. And again, it kind of shows how older Americans kind of see this world as just being out of control here, that people are pushing the boundaries of what's normal, what's accepted in almost every place, and that they feel kind of being attacked and losing control of the situation. From the other side, right, these younger people that are trying to change these things, right? Catherine Switzer is saying, why can't I do these things that we say are supposed to be open to everybody? Why isn't there true equality in our system, in our country, right? So again, something has to give here. Something has to be set in place, right? So in response to this, in part, right, the women's movement by the early 1970s starts calling for real, true equality, guaranteed equality in the Constitution of the United States. Not just in a law, because laws can be undone. Laws can be not enforced, right? Laws can become meaningless after a while. So a lot of women, this women's movement that's built up here in the 1950s and 60s, starts calling for a change of the Constitution, a new amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, this isn't new. One had been approved, or one had been proposed in the early 20th century. It's revamped here in the 1960s and approved by Congress in 1972 and goes out to the states for ratification. By 1977, 35 states have approved, but it's not nearly enough to pass, right? You need 37 states to ratify an amendment to the Constitution. So here by 1977, we notice that the momentum seems to be waning here in a lot of ways, right? And as you notice in these pictures, on the lower left-hand picture, you see a group of women out there protesting, saying, hey, look, we need equality. Women need legal equality. They need economic equality, educational opportunities, right? Equality. They want to be treated the same as men. But look in that lower right-hand corner, right? The woman in the center of this picture, her name's Phyllis Schlafly. She's one of those women that's kind of identified with this idea of conformity, that women have a certain role to play in American society. There's a certain place for women in this society. And if you kind of look at who's in these two pictures, again, it's not perfect, it's not complete, right? But for the most part, older women are saying, hey, wait a minute, this is too much change going too far. Younger women saying it's not enough change, it hasn't gone far enough. But these older women are actually starting to slow, to blunt the pace of this change. They're the ones out there saying, no, we don't want this amendment. We feel that it'll change things too much, that it won't allow women to do what we think women should do, and that's stay home and take care of kids and take care of the domestic sphere, so to speak. So here in the 1970s, you really see this breakdown happening, and the Nixon administration is kind of caught in the middle of it, if you will. And the thing that's really going to set the stage for the future here, one that we're still arguing about almost 50 years later, is a court case that happens in the very next year after the Equal Rights Amendment is proposed. And that, of course, is the court case, the Supreme Court case, Roe versus Wade. There, a young woman known as Jane Roe anonymously in the court case, wants to get an abortion. She's not married. She doesn't want to have the child that she's pregnant with because it will derail her life and put her in extreme conditions. The man that she had the child with says that he wants to keep the child and that he wants her to go ahead and have the child for him, even though he's not going to take legal custody. I think the child was originally going to be given up for adoption after the birth. Well, the young woman in this case says, wait a minute, that's not his choice to make. I'm the one whose life is going to be changed here. I'm the one that's not going to be able to go to school. I'm the one that's not going to be able to have a job. I'm the one that's going to have to make the decision of what happens to this child after it's born. She says, it's my choice what happens here. So, of course, this case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And eventually, in 1973, the Supreme Court says, look, ultimately, this should be the woman's choice. She's the one that has to make that decision. She's the one whose life is going to be affected by this process of giving birth, right, of having a child. So she ultimately should have the choice. A lot of women applaud this, especially younger women, saying, hey, look, that's right. I should have the ability to decide for myself, not with some man's permission, what I can or can't do. But of course, a lot of conservative women, a lot of conservative men see this exactly the opposite. They say, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that. You can't stop a child from being born just because you don't want to, right? So again, these very deep cultural conflicts are starting to kind of rise to the surface here in the 1970s. And again, the Nixon administration is caught in the middle of much of this. And what we kind of see is it's a lasting legacy, if you will, right? This map from 2016, and it's actually even changed just in the last 3 or 4 years from this, more and more states are pushing for limits to the idea of abortion. That these conservative forces that are kind of unleashed here in the 1970s as a response to the Civil Rights Act, the women's movement, and other kind of civil rights groups and changes, they're pushing back here. and they're starting to get a lot of momentum in the early 2000s. They're starting to roll back some of these big changes that were put in place by the civil rights movement, the women's movement in the 1960s and 70s. So something to kind of keep in mind. Again, a lot of these issues, police brutality, segregation, educational opportunities, economic opportunities for men and women, and a lot of this hasn't gone away. The fight over abortion very much shows that as well. Okay. All right, we're going to leave it there for this part. We'll pick it up again in our next lecture, where we kind of pick up with identity politics. The fact is, it's not just women and African Americans calling for change here in the 60s and 70s. There's whole different groups of people emerging, pushing for change. And again, the Nixon administration kind of has to navigate all of this and try to find a way to kind of hold enough of the country together to get things done. And it's going to be very difficult, especially based on some of the actions the Nixon administration takes, especially a big one known as Watergate. All right, so we'll pick it up from there next time. Thank you, guys.